She had forgotten what that laugh sounded like. Renata Voss stood alone in the security office on the 14th floor of the Nexus building, lit only by the pale blue glow of the monitor bank. It was 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. She had come in to pull a contract timestamp, a 5-minute errand, and then the camera feed on the far left screen had stopped her cold. Sloane was sitting on the lobby floor, not on the bench near the revolving door. On the floor, cross-legged on the polished stone, and she was laughing, shoulders shaking, head tipped back, laughing the way children laugh when something genuinely catches them off guard. Renata stood very still and watched, and it took her 3 full seconds to recognize her own daughter. 3 full seconds, because she had not seen that expression in so long she had almost stopped expecting it to exist. The man sitting across from Sloane wore a high-visibility vest and work pants with a reflective stripe down the leg. He was not performing, not leaning in or making exaggerated gestures, not doing any of the things adults do when they are trying too hard. He was simply sitting on the floor, not in a chair, the floor and talking, and whatever he had just said had cracked something open in Sloane that Renata had not been able to reach in 2 years. He did not look at the camera. He had no idea she was watching. The first question that moved through her was not, "Who is he?" It was not, "Is she safe?" The first question, the one that settled in her chest, like something heavy and long overdue, was this: "How long has my daughter been sitting in this lobby, laughing like that, and I didn't know?" Wyatt Callan had been putting things behind him for most of his adult life. 3 tours in 11 years, 1 in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, had trained him to file things away rather than carry them. The noise, the waiting, the particular quality of silence that came before something bad. You filed it. You moved. You did not sit with it because sitting with it had a cost, and there was always the next thing that needed doing. He had filed the Silver Star the same way. Kunar Province, autumn of 2007, a ridgeline position that the rest of his unit could not hold. He had stayed and held it alone for 4 hours while the others got out. When they gave him the medal, he shook the general's hand and said thank you, and filed that away too, into the same place where he kept things that did not change the morning. He came home in 2013 with 2 decorations and no transferable credentials. That was how the rejection letters framed it. 12 applications over 14 months, federal law enforcement, government facility security, military air traffic coordination, 3 different agencies that should have known what a ranger could do, not qualified, does not meet civilian certification requirements. We will keep your application on file. 12 times, and then he stopped counting. Marge Tullis called him. She was a former Army logistics sergeant who ran the sanitation district route in Chicago's Meridian Corridor, and she had found his application through a Veterans Outreach Board. She did not ask about his qualifications. She asked if he was willing to work and could show up on time. He said yes to both. She said be there Monday. That had been 6 years ago. Dana died in March of 2021, 14 months after the diagnosis, when Owen was 4 years old and still believed that everything his father did was correct. The grief had not destroyed Wyatt the way he had expected. It had done something quieter and more thorough. It had emptied him of the particular energy that used to power the parts of him that reached toward things. He still functioned. He still showed up. He just stopped reaching. Owen was 9 now, wiry and direct, with his mother's habit of saying exactly what he meant. After school, he rode the bus to the Nexus building and sat in the lobby and read or drew while his father finished the late rotation. It was their system. He had first noticed the girl 3 weeks before the night Renata stood at the camera screen. She was sitting in the far chair closest to the corner, farthest from the door, with her phone face down on her knee and her eyes on the middle distance. Not reading, not looking at anything in particular, just occupying the minimum amount of space available. Wyatt had nodded his customary greeting, and she had not responded. She was there the next day, and the day after, in the same chair with the same careful stillness. By the end of the first week, he had started to notice the details. The way she watched the revolving door every time it moved, not with curiosity, but with the patient attention of someone who had been waiting a long time. The way she drew her bag slightly closer whenever a stranger passed. She was not frightened. She was simply, thoroughly alone. Wyatt had seen that quality before. In Owen, in the months after Dana died, on the 8th day, while they were waiting for the service elevator, he said quietly to Owen, "That kid over there looks like she's having a rough time." Owen looked over at Sloane, considered her with the frank assessment of a 9-year-old, and nodded. Then he picked up his notebook and walked across the lobby and sat down next to her without asking permission, and opened his book to a drawing he was working on. He did not introduce himself. He did not explain himself. He just sat down. Wyatt went back to his route. The morning after the camera feed stopped her cold, before she opened her laptop, Renata asked Sloane about it. They were eating breakfast in the kitchen of their apartment on Michigan Avenue. Sloane in her school uniform with her hair still damp, and Renata kept it casual the way she had learned to make things casual since the divorce, since Sloane had stopped trusting questions that came at her directly. "Who were you talking to last night?" In the lobby, Sloane looked up from her cereal. The yellow vest guy, Owen's dad, not with wariness, not with the careful neutrality she used when a conversation was heading somewhere she didn't want to go. She said it the way she would say the mailbox is on the corner, as simple fact, as something that had already become ordinary. That was what stopped Renata. Not the content of the answer, but its texture. Easy, familiar, as if this were simply part of how things were now, and her mother was the last to know it. She waited until Sloane had left for school. Then she called her assistant. The sanitation contract for the Nexus building ran through a company called Midwest Clean Solutions. The route assignment for the Meridian District evening rotation was held by one employee, Wyatt Callan. 6 years on the same route. Clean record, no complaints, no incidents. One commendation from a building manager for staying an extra shift during a water main emergency 2 winters ago. Her assistant kept looking. The name appeared in a Chicago Tribune Metro brief from 2019. 4 military veterans had filed a joint complaint against the Department of Labor, alleging systematic denial of federal employment applications without cause or adequate review. The case had been dismissed on procedural grounds. Wyatt Callan was second from the bottom of the list. She asked for everything available on his service record: Army Ranger, 75th Regiment, 3 deployments between 2003 and 2013, a Purple Heart citation from 2011 IED contact, and a Silver Star, awarded 2007, Kunar Province, Eastern Afghanistan. The citation language was formal and compressed, but the facts inside it were not small. Sergeant Callan had maintained a defensive position alone for 4 hours, while the remainder of his element withdrew to safety. He had held a ridgeline under direct fire until everyone else was out. Renata sat at her desk and read that sentence 3 times. Then she looked at his employment file again. 6 years on a garbage route in Chicago. She was still sitting with it when her assistant knocked to say her 10 o'clock was waiting. That same afternoon, Owen arrived in the lobby and found Sloane already in the far chair. He sat down next to her. He had stopped announcing himself, because she had stopped needing him to, and they fell into the easy quiet that had apparently become the texture of their afternoons. It had been tentative in the first week. Now it was not. Renata, finishing a call on the 14th floor, did not know any of this was happening 3 stories below her. She was looking at the Silver Star citation on her screen. She read the phrase while the remainder of his element withdrew to safety one more time, and then she closed the tab, and she thought about a man who had held a line alone so that everyone else could get out, and who was now collecting garbage on a Chicago night route because 12 agencies had looked at his file and decided he did not have the right certification. She did not know yet what she was going to do with that thought, but she could not put it down. Preston Hale had seen them himself. He had been coming out of a late meeting on the 3rd floor, briefcase in hand, walking through the lobby toward the parking elevator when he saw his CEO standing near the service corridor entrance in a low conversation with the man who collected the building's trash. It had lasted less than 2 minutes. But Preston Hale was the kind of man who cataloged things, and he had cataloged that. He came to her office the following morning before her schedule started. Preston was 52. With the careful grooming of a man who believed appearance was argument. He had been CFO of Voss Meridian for 4 years, had survived the scandal and the restructuring that followed, and had made himself indispensable through a combination of institutional knowledge and selective loyalty that Renata had always found difficult to fully trust without being able to say exactly why. He sat across from her desk, crossed one leg over the other, and said he wanted to share a concern. He said the board had been watching closely since last year's coverage. She understood what he meant. They both did, and there was no need to name it, and that optics mattered in ways that were sometimes unfair but nonetheless real. He said he wasn't suggesting anything was wrong. He just wanted her to be careful. He said all of it with the practiced warmth of a man who is issuing a warning while ensuring nothing on record looks like one. Renata let him finish. Then she said, "Thank you, Preston," and she watched his face for the half-second before he arranged it back into concern. What she saw in that half-second was not worry, it was relief, the brief, involuntary exhale of a man who has just fired a warning shot and felt it land where he intended. She filed that away. He was not protecting the company, he was protecting something else. She didn't know what yet, but she had been running Voss Meridian for 6 years, and she knew the difference between a man who was worried and a man who was scared. Preston Hale was scared, and he had come into her office and tried to make that her problem. She did not give him the satisfaction of a visible reaction, but she did not forget what she had seen on his face. That evening she stayed in the building past 6. She told herself she was working, and she was, until she was not. From the first-floor corridor, through the glass wall that overlooked the lobby atrium, she could see Owen and Sloane in the far corner. Owen had a paperback with a dragon on the cover and was reading aloud in different voices for different characters. Sloane was listening with her knees pulled up and her chin resting on them, the posture she had when something genuinely held her. She was not performing. She was just there, absorbed, the way she used to be before everything changed. Wyatt came through the atrium once during his route. He did not stop to check on Owen. He did not linger near the children. He nodded when he passed and kept moving. He had set something in motion and then stepped entirely out of its way. Renata had spent 2 years trying to fix this, and she had been standing directly in its path the entire time. For 3 more evenings she stayed and watched. On the 4th she moved closer to the glass, where she could hear as well as see. Owen had set his book down, and they were sitting in silence, the easy, undemanding silence of 2 people who had decided they were comfortable with each other. After a while, Sloane said something low, and Owen turned toward her and listened with the full, unhurried attention of a child who has not yet learned to simulate it. Renata could not make out the words. She watched Owen's face do something complicated. Later, she would ask Sloane what had been said. Sloane told her she had described a girl at her old school. They had sat next to each other in reading group for most of 2nd grade, who had come up to her one morning the week after the newspaper story ran and asked, in the flat and curious voice of a child, simply repeating what she had heard at home, "Is your dad the one in the pictures?" Sloane had not answered. She had picked up her book and found a page to stare at, and from that morning she made sure to arrive just after the reading group started and leave just before it ended, so there was no open window for anyone to ask her anything. She had not spoken to that girl again. She had not spoken to any girl in that class again. Owen had listened without interrupting. Then he said, "My dad's been in the newspaper too. They called him a homeless veteran even though he has a house." He said it simply, without trying to match her hurt or outpace it, just offered it the way you offer something small that might be useful. Sloane looked at him. He shrugged. He said, "Newspapers get stuff wrong." They had sat with that for a while. Renata stood at the glass with her hand flat against the cold pane and her eyes burning. She did not go in. That night, Sloane found Renata reading in the living room and sat on the arm of the couch the way she used to when she was small and wanted to be near without making a production of it. Renata held very still. She had learned this, that the wrong kind of attention could make Sloane retreat back into the careful distance she had built around herself, and that the right kind of attention was mostly not moving, not questioning, not arranging, just being in the room. After a moment, Sloane said, "Mom, why don't I have any friends?" Not angry, not accusing. Asking the way a child asks when they genuinely don't know the answer and believe the adult in the room might. Renata put her book down. She had explanations: the move, the school change, the year that had overturned everything, but those were not answers to the question Sloane was actually asking, and they both would have known it. She opened her mouth and closed it, and sat in the silence of not knowing what to say to her own daughter. Through the window that overlooked the building's service corridor, she could see the faint movement of Wyatt's cart as he finished his route. He pushed it past the glass without looking up. He did not know she was watching again. The following evening, Renata was pulling into the parking garage at 5:50 when the collection truck reversed slowly out of the service bay at the far end of the 2nd level. She stopped. The truck stopped. They faced each other across the length of the garage headlights and taillights, both waiting. The driver's window came down. Wyatt leaned out and said, "Sorry, didn't see you, I'll pull back." She had her window down too. She said, "I know." And then the truck moved forward and she eased past. 8 seconds. She drove to her parking space, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark car for a moment longer than necessary. She went up to the lobby at 6:15. Owen and Sloane had already left. She stood in the center of the atrium for a moment, and then walked toward the service corridor with the deliberate quality of a decision that had already been made. Wyatt was at the far end, transferring bags from a cart to the collection dolly, moving with the economy of someone who has done the same task thousands of times and stopped thinking about the individual steps. She said, "Your name is Wyatt Callan," not a question. He looked up, no particular surprise in his face. He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Do you know who my daughter is?" He considered for a moment. Then he said, "The kid who always takes the far chair. Likes the books about ocean stuff more than the ones about superheroes." Renata stopped. She had come prepared for deflection, the careful distance adults maintained when they sensed a conversation turning complicated. She had not expected specificity. She had not expected him to have been paying that kind of attention. She said, "What are you doing with her?" He said, "Owen likes having someone to sit with. I let him work it out himself." There was a version of that answer that would have been deflection polite, vague, the kind of response people gave when they wanted to end a conversation without confrontation. This was not that version. He said it the same way he had said everything else, directly, without hedging, with no apparent interest in how it landed. He was simply telling her what was true. He looked at her for one even second. Then he picked up the dolly handle and pushed it toward the service bay, and she listened to the wheels on the concrete until the door swung shut. She stood in the empty corridor for a long time after he was gone. She had walked in with a question and walked out with something she could not categorize, and she was not accustomed to that. She had managed a company through a public scandal, had navigated lawyers and journalists and a board that watched her for signs of weakness, and none of it had left her standing in an empty corridor without knowing where she stood. The man who collected the building's garbage had done that, and he had not seemed to notice. She went back upstairs and sat at her desk and did not open any of the files she had meant to open. She looked at the city through the window. The lights were coming on across the Lake District, the buildings going bright floor by floor against the darkening sky. She thought about a man who noticed what kind of books a child preferred and had never mentioned it to anyone. After a while, she realized she had been sitting there for 14 minutes, which was not something she did. Renata called Marge Tullis the following morning. Marge ran the Nexus sanitation route and had a directness she had always appreciated. She explained that she needed to review the lobby camera archive for the previous 5 weeks, and Marge said she would set it up. Renata watched the footage alone on a Thursday evening, in the same security office where she had first stopped cold a week earlier. She went back 5 weeks and found Wyatt on the first day, moving through on his regular route with Owen trailing behind. She found Sloane in the far chair. She watched. Wyatt passed, nodded once, kept moving. Sloane did not look up. She watched the second day, the third, the fourth. On day 5, when Wyatt nodded, Sloane's head moved just a fraction of a lift, the involuntary acknowledgement of someone who has been seen one too many times to fully ignore. She found day 8. Wyatt paused near the elevator and turned toward Owen and said something. Owen tilted his head, listening, then picked up his notebook and crossed the lobby and sat down beside Sloane without ceremony. He did not explain himself. He just sat down. Wyatt did not watch him go. He turned back to his cart and kept moving. She found day 15. Wyatt on the floor, the card game, 15 minutes, then gone. She went back to the night that had stopped her Sloane laughing and watched it 3 times. The first viewing she spent on Sloane. On the second, she watched Wyatt. He was not laughing. He was watching her laugh, and the expression on his face was not the warmth of an adult who has just charmed a child. It was something harder to name, the look of someone who recognized something he had been quietly afraid might no longer exist, and was careful about it, the way you are careful about things you know can still be broken. She called him at 9:47. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because if you knew, you would manage it." and it would stop working. The silence after that was several seconds long. She had no answer, because he was correct, and they both understood it. She had managed everything for 2 years, the lawyers and the press and the school transfer and the therapy appointments and the carefully curated playdate invitations that Sloane had declined, every one. She had managed every variable she could identify. She had missed this one entirely. She said, "When did you first notice her?" He said, "Week 1. She sits the way Owen sat after his mother died. Back of the room, takes up as little space as possible. Not sad exactly. Just very careful." Renata sat with that for a long moment. What he was describing was her daughter, a description more precise than anything her daughter's therapist had offered in 12 months of sessions. He had arrived at it in a week by doing nothing more elaborate than paying attention. She said, "I want to talk to you, in person." A pause. Then he said, "All right." He said it the same way he said everything, without hedging, without asking what the conversation would be about. She had half expected him to ask. He did not. He said he would be in the garage around 5:30 the following afternoon. She was there at 5:25, standing near the concrete pillar with her hands in her coat pockets, and she understood, waiting for him, that she had not done this in 2 years, either stood somewhere and waited for a conversation she had not already planned. They stood near the concrete pillar at the far edge of the parking level, away from the camera angles she knew well by now, close enough to the overhead light that she could read his face. He had come straight from the route. He still had his vest on. She asked him about Dana first. She had read the death record in the background check her assistant had run, but a record only told you the fact, not the shape of it. He told her without ornamentation. Dana had been 36 when they found the cancer. 14 months later, she was gone. Owen had been young enough that the explicit memory would thin over time, old enough to carry the outline of what was missing long after the word for it had faded from his vocabulary. He paused. Traffic from the street above came filtered and remote through the concrete. He said, "She was the kind of person who knew how to be in a room. Not loud about it. She just made wherever she was feel like the right place to be." He said that for a long time after she died, he would catch himself noticing things she would have noticed a good window. The way light hit the water in the drainage canal on his route, someone's dog on the sidewalk pulling against its leash. He would register these things and then turn to point them out, and she would not be there, and he would carry each observation alone until it dissolved on its own. He said, that was the hardest part, not the grief, which was large and unavoidable, the small accumulation of things noticed, and nowhere to put them, the unreceived, the unshared, the ordinary details that require another person to complete. Renata did not say anything. She let him finish. He said that 2 years after, he had tried to fix Owen the way he fixed problems systematically. Classes, activities, children selected for the right reasons, arranged the whole thing like a logistics problem. He said, none of it worked. Then, one afternoon, Owen was at a park on the north side, and there was a kid on the climbing structure. Owen went over. By the time I looked up, they were playing. I hadn't arranged anything. I hadn't coached him. I had just stopped standing in the way. He looked at her and said, "That's all I've been doing here." Renata said, "You're not angry? About the medals and 12 times they said no?" He said, "I used to be." He looked at the floor for a moment. He said, "I don't have the bandwidth for it anymore. I have Owen. I have a job that pays. That's enough." She said, "I don't know what enough looks like anymore." She had not planned to say it. It came out in the same quiet register as everything else she had said that evening, and she could not take it back and did not try to. They stayed in the parking garage for another 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular about the building's HVAC system, which he had opinions about, and about Owen's drawing, which had gotten detailed enough that strangers sometimes stopped to ask what he was working on. Ordinary things, the kind of conversation that only happened when two people had already finished the harder conversation and found that neither of them wanted to leave yet. At some point, she stopped keeping track of the time entirely. The memo arrived the following Friday morning, distributed to the board liaisons and 3 senior vice presidents under Preston Hale's name. It cited concerns about leadership consistency and professional boundaries. It included, as an attachment, a photograph taken from a public angle outside the Nexus building, Renata in her coat, Wyatt in his vest, standing near the garage entrance, talking. The image was grainy and unremarkable. The implication lived entirely in the framing, in the choice of subject and the decision to circulate it. Marge called Wyatt before he came in that morning and read him the relevant sections without commentary. He listened. He said, "I'll put in for a route transfer." She said, "Don't do that." He said, "I don't want her catching trouble on my account." Marge said, "She's the one who gets to decide what she catches." He came in anyway. Renata found him in the lobby during the afternoon rotation and crossed the floor to him directly. She said, "I know about the memo." He said, "Then you understand why I should probably move to another building." She looked at him and said, "If you leave because of this, I'm letting him define the boundaries of what I'm allowed to do. I stopped accepting that. I'm not going back to it." He held her gaze. He said, "All right." The following morning he arrived before his shift and went upstairs without an appointment and told the receptionist he needed 2 minutes. He stood in the lobby until Renata came down. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday." He said it carefully. The way he said things he had already turned over more than once. He said, "I don't want you keeping me here because you feel like you owe me something. I'm asking you something simpler. Do you actually want me to stay?" She looked at him. She said, "I don't want you to go." He nodded once. Then he went back downstairs and started his route. She took the elevator to her office and called Daniel Forsyth. Daniel had been CFO of Voss Meridian before Preston, left on good terms 3 years ago, and still answered when she called. She told him she needed him to look at specific line items in the consulting ledger from 2022 items she had flagged months earlier, when something in the numbers had not aligned the way it should and had not yet had a formal reason to pursue further. She had the reference numbers. She needed a second set of eyes she could trust. Daniel called back the following morning. There was a services agreement in the 2022 ledger, signed unilaterally by Preston Hale, with no board authorization and no corresponding disclosure to the audit committee. The counterparty was a holding LLC. Traced back through 3 layers of registered filings, the beneficial owner was Garrett Voss, her ex-husband. Renata sat with that for a long moment. Then she opened a clean document and began making notes. That night, Sloane was doing math homework at the kitchen table, and she looked up and said, "Do you know Owen's dad?" Renata said, "I know who he is, yes." Sloane said, "He sits on the floor. When he talks to us, he sits on the floor." Renata said, "I heard that." Sloane went back to her worksheet, then said quietly, "Is he going to stop coming to the building?" Renata said, "No, he is not going to stop." The boardroom on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, and on the afternoon of the full board meeting, the light came in flat and gray from the lake. 7 members present. 2. On video. Preston Hale sat at the far end of the table with his presentation loaded, and the controlled composure of a man who had rehearsed and believed he was prepared. He spoke for 11 minutes. He used the words consistency and representation and stakeholder confidence in measured succession. He did not say anything directly accusatory. He did not need to. The implication was designed to move through the room on its own, unattributable, doing the work he had built it to do. Renata let him finish. She waited until the room had resettled around his final sentence. Then she pulled up 3 documents on the shared screen. The first was the services agreement from 2022, a single page, signed by Preston Hale, with no board authorization number and no counter-signature from legal. The second was the audit committee disclosure register for that fiscal year, showing no corresponding entry. The third was a written analysis Daniel Forsyth had prepared, tracing the beneficial ownership of the counterparty LLC through 3 layers of registered filings to a single name, with his professional signature on the bottom. She said, "This agreement was signed without board authorization, without disclosure to the audit committee, and without the knowledge of company leadership. The beneficial owner of the counterparty is a party with a direct personal relationship to this company's prior leadership structure." She said, "I am requesting the immediate formation of an independent audit committee to review all consulting engagements executed by the CFO's office between 2021 and the present." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. The board chair looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he said, "So moved." The motion passed. Preston's signing authority was suspended pending the committee's review. He would have lawyers. It would take weeks. But the room understood what suspension signaled and what it predicted, and so did he. His face had gone the color of old concrete. Renata closed the presentation and looked at the table, not at Preston. The board chair asked if there was other business. There was not. The members began gathering their materials with the particular efficiency of people who want to exit a room without discussion. Preston remained in his seat. Renata could feel him on the far end of the table without looking, still and silent, calculating what remained available to him. She did not look at him. There was nothing more to say to Preston Hale that needed saying in this room. She was still looking at the table when, from beyond the glass corridor wall, a child's voice came through high and clear and completely unguarded, the way children call out when they have no sense that modulation might be required. Mr. Wyatt. Every head in the boardroom turned. Through the corridor window they could see the lobby atrium below. A small girl running across the marble toward a man in a yellow vest who had stopped near the service door, and from the opposite direction a boy at a run, and the two children reaching each other in the middle of the wide floor with the unself-conscious certainty of people who are simply glad. Sloane's laugh rose through the glass and filled the corridor. Renata looked at the window. She did not explain. There was nothing in that room that required explanation from her. 3 weeks after the board meeting, the Independent Audit Committee completed its review. The findings matched the documents. Preston Hale accepted a separation agreement, a structured exit with a confidentiality clause, designed to avoid the delay and visibility of civil litigation, and cleared his office on a Wednesday morning in November. The board voted 8-1 to retain Renata Voss as CEO without conditions. She went back to work. Sloane started a Saturday morning drawing class at a studio 4 blocks from the apartment. She had asked for it herself. That was the detail Renata kept returning to, not that the class existed, but that Sloane had come and asked. It was the first time in 2 years her daughter had reached towards something social on her own terms. She and Owen were in the same session. Wyatt stayed on the Meridian route. Renata had not offered him another position or any gesture that could be read as a debt being settled. She had thought about it and stopped herself because she had learned something across those weeks, watching a 9-year-old boy cross a marble floor and sit down next to a girl he didn't know and open a book about what help looked like when it worked. It required getting out of the way. On a Thursday in late November, around 6 in the evening, she came down to the lobby. She told herself she was checking for a package and did not examine that explanation closely. She heard the cart before she saw him, the small familiar sound of wheels on the service corridor floor, and then Wyatt came through the door into the atrium and looked up and found her standing there. He stopped. Neither of them said anything. She walked to the middle of the lobby, the exact spot where she had watched, on a camera screen 3 floors above. Her daughter laughed for the first time in 2 years, and she sat down on the floor. The marble was cold through her slacks. She sat cross-legged with her hands in her lap. Wyatt stood for a moment. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, but the recognition of a man registering something he had not let himself expect. He set the cart handle down, walked over, and sat beside her on the floor. The building settled around them. The ventilation, the distant hum of the elevators, the muffled city through the tall windows. The light had gone amber with the evening. From the far corridor came 2 pairs of feet, quick and light, not paying attention to where they were going because they were paying attention to each other. Owen and Sloane came around the corner from the elevator bank, heads bent over his notebook, mid-sentence. They crossed the lobby without looking up. Then Sloane looked up. She saw her mother on the floor. She saw Wyatt beside her. She did not ask why. She crossed the last stretch of marble at a run and folded herself down at Renata's side, pressing in close the way she had when she was very small, before she had learned to be careful. Owen sat down next to his father with the easy certainty of someone claiming a familiar seat. He opened his notebook and kept drawing, as if this were simply where everyone was. The 4 of them sat on the lobby floor of the Nexus building, while the last evening light moved across the stone. No one was above anyone. No one owed anyone anything. No one was trying. 4 people on the floor. Even, at last,